right? And I'm going to be talking about section 176 of the criminal code, which talks about, hey, look, you can't go into a service and interrupt it or disrupt it. If you do, it's a criminal offense, right? That's a very moral criminal law. Why do we have that? Well, because we decided 100 years ago that this nation was going to have morals. We were going to have moral-based laws, and we were going to protect certain values, like gathering together and gathering together for worship, because that's actually part of our nation, believe it or not, right? I mean, everybody knows, whether you like to admit it or not, freedom, as we know it in the world today, is rooted in the values of the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's how we get America, Britain, Canada, these places that were or are free. That's how you get them, right? You don't have that in nations that don't have that, like Iran, like China. So this case really is about, what does this nation want to be going forward?
Do you know the story of Church in the Vine from Edmonton, Alberta? The pastors there, great people, Tracy and Rodney Fortin. They rejected the government's intrusion into their church under the guise of coronavirus restrictions from really the very beginning of this. At Church in the Vine, they did their best to comply with COVID restrictions that made sense, but they weren't going to aggressively police their congregation for COVID compliance on behalf of state inspectors, and they weren't about to turn any worshipers away. And they for sure were not going to let the state send their own inspectors in to disrupt worship services every Sunday to check for COVID compliance. And that, my friends, is when all the trouble started. Pastor Tracy would post herself up at the front door of the church and prevent the inspectors from coming in, to prevent the inspectors from disrupting worship services. Here's Tracy explaining.
Our resolve to stand against this tyranny is even stronger than it was 6 months ago. Alberta Health Services, government officials, we love you. We care about you. But you're not welcome in our building during a religious service.
Unless they're coming to church.
If you are coming to worship, not only will I let you in, I will open the door for you and I will welcome you with open arms. But in an official working capacity, they're simply not welcome. And as far as checking for identification or QR codes or taking names or checking vaccine status at the door, absolutely not. Never.
Now for that, sweet little Tracy and the church itself as an entity are facing obstruction charges. Not criminal obstruction charges. These are a regulatory offense, but with those come enormous escalating fines of up to $100,000 per charge for Tracy and up to $500,000 per charge for the church. It's really been a twisted tale with Church in the Vine, because when the government couldn't get the health inspectors in, then they started sending occupational health and safety inspectors to try to get into the church to inspect it as though it were some sort of construction site. That didn't work either, and the church was levied fines again. And then all of a sudden they weren't, because they had the help of a really great lawyer named James Kitchen. It's been a real mess, but Tracy and Rodney and Church in the Vine have had that same lawyer this whole time, James Kitchen. He's been with them, helping them navigate the legal system from the very beginning, but so have you, because you have enabled all of this through your generous donations to fightthefines.com. That's a civil liberties project in partnership with the registered Canadian charity, the Democracy Fund, which works to advance civil liberties and civil liberties education, and often through important litigation efforts like this one. Now, next week, beginning Tuesday, Church in the Vine and sweet Pastor Tracy are headed to trial on 3 charges of obstruction of a public health officer. And their lawyer, the aforementioned James Kitchen, joins me right now for an update to the case.
So next week, April 19th, we're going to trial on 3 obstruction charges against Tracy Fortin, who is the pastor and wife of Rodney Fortin, also pastor at Church in the Vine in Edmonton. Now, these are obstruction charges under Section 71 of the Public Health Act. So they're not criminal obstruction charges. This is what we often call in law a regulatory offense, which is to say that there's this provincial legislation and somebody has allegedly breached it. So it's a regulatory offense. The jeopardy is not jail time. It's not a criminal record. It's just a fine, potentially a very large fine, but a fine. So we have 3 charges for that, 3 allegations of denial of entry to an AHS officer on certain dates in 2021. And so there's 3 separate charges under Section 71 for obstructing an AHS officer. That's the allegation. So we're going to go to trial proper for that next week, which is to say we're going to actually go through the case of whether or not that happened, whether or not the Crown has actually met their onus, which is to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that it actually occurred. So even though this isn't technically a criminal trial, because it's not criminal charges, it's procedurally going to be similar. The burden on the Crown is the same idea, right? So, what I get to argue as defense counsel is, well, look, the Crown hasn't shown beyond a reasonable doubt that obstruction has actually been made out. And if that's the case, then great. Tracy and the church is not guilty, and that's it, right? Whether or not that's going to happen, I don't know. I'm going to try. But the other part of the case is the charter aspect. And this is where I say, look, maybe there was obstruction, so maybe there's a conviction, but that has to be thrown out because of the charter breaches, right? So I argue, look, it violates freedom of religion, quite obviously, right? I mean, this woman, this AHS woman, is demanding access during an ongoing worship gathering on Sunday morning, right? So it's not like she's wanting to come during the week and see what's going on, or she wants to watch online or whatever. She's trying to enter into the not merely the church, into the sanctuary in the midst of worship. Okay. And, to people who don't go to church, they say, what's the big deal? But I mean, you ask any like Orthodox Jew or Muslim or Christian, they say that's a really big deal. I'm literally in communion with the divine God Almighty, right? And some government official is going to come in and interrupt that communion. That's a pretty big deal. It's difficult to explain that in 2022 to non-religious people, but that's kind of what's at the heart of this case. So that's freedom of religion. And of course, there's freedom of assembly and freedom of association. You have hundreds of people gathering together in the sanctuary, which it's important that it's called that. And that is to be a protected, sacred, important time, not to be interfered with or disrupted by an officer of the government coming in and basically spying on these people to see if she can get them in trouble. And so I'm going to allege charter breaches in that. And then, of course, if I'm successful, if I can establish a charter breach, then I get to argue that under Section 24 sub 1 of the charter, the charges should be thrown out. So even though the Crown's met their case, even though they've established on the facts and on the law that there was obstruction, it should nonetheless be thrown out because the charter breaches demand that there's a remedy, and the remedy is to throw it out. So that's the second part of the case that I'm hoping to be able to argue. I don't actually know that I will be, because the Crown has alleged that those arguments themselves are so weak that I shouldn't even have the opportunity to argue them. So the judge that's going to be a trial application at the very beginning of the trial. That's going to be a preliminary application. If the Crown is successful on that, it'll be a very short trial, probably only a day. I won't get to make charter arguments. That'll be very disappointing. And so we won't get to do that second part of the case. I am fairly confident we're going to win on that. The law is pretty clear. If the judge is really following the law, I really do think he's going to permit the charter argument to go forward, and we're going to have a full 3-day trial, and we're going to get to argue the charter and talk about freedom of religion and all that.
Well, I'm going to cover it like Nancy Grace covers OJ. I'm going to be live tweeting the whole thing. I can't wait. I know that you're a passionate believer in religious freedom. I'm so happy that you are fighting for Tracy and Rodney. They're such good people. And it just seems bizarre that the potential is there that they might not be allowed those charter arguments, because why do they think that Tracy was barring the door, if not to protect the sanctity of the religious service?
Yeah, I know. So I'm sure you have those documents I've sent you. I'd love for people to read those, because hopefully that helps them to understand at a written level what's going on here and what the Crown's trying to do and what I'm saying really needs to be done if we're going to have a fair trial.
Now, what are the potential fines that Tracy and Rodney could face, or Tracy in particular?
Theoretically, $100,000 for each offense. So prior to 2020, these were either $2,000 or $5,000, which is typical. That would be standard for this type of thing. Okay. And then, of course, the UCP came in and they jacked up the fines for these public health offenses all the way up to $100,000. $500,000 if it's an entity. So theoretically, because both the Church and the Vine and Tracy are named in this as the accused, theoretically, although I do think it's unlikely, the court, if it really wanted to, if the Crown was successful, they could levy fines of $500,000 3 times for each offense to the church, in addition to $100,000 to Tracy Fortin. That's what the legislation allows for maximum fines. As far as I know, we haven't seen anything like that yet. Even with all the arresting of pastors and all the tyranny and oppression that we saw, I haven't seen fines that have been anywhere near that. I think that was largely a scare tactic by the UCP, an effective one. I think people see that and they kind of freak out, especially since they don't really know the law, or they're scared because the court don't have better not do it. No, I might have, and it was 5,000. I better not now that it's 1,000, or sorry, 100,000. So I think it's unlikely, but that is possible. I mean, we saw the judge and how angry he was at Pastor Coates. We've seen other judges and how angry they were at Pastor Pulowski, for example. So if we get an angry judge who thinks these pastors are destroying society, they might decide, hey, I want to send a message. I want to bury them, right? I mean, I think there's a church in Ontario, Jacob Reum's church, Trinity something or other. They are Bible. Facing, yep. Yeah, I'm pretty sure they're facing a total of 6 digits in fines. So over 100,000 there in total between various fines. So, it's possible. And obviously those numbers are really devastating. So it is, the stakes are potentially pretty high. I mean, on the penalty side, obviously the stakes are high in general, because we're dealing with, a government, as if it wasn't Canada, a government saying, let us in on Sunday morning against your will, to spy on your sanctuary. And if you don't, we're going to ruin your lives. I mean, that's, so those stakes are really high, because that goes right to the very core and soul of our nation. Be a democratic nation or not, either what we want to be, what we have been for 150 years, or China, or South Korea, or North Korea, or take your pick, Russia, whatever it is, whatever place where these things do actually happen on a regular basis. Who do we want to be, right? And that's a lot of my argument is going to ultimately be, what has this nation been? Okay, what do its laws protect, and what is it going to be going forward? Right. And I'm going to be talking about Section 176 of the Criminal Code, which talks about, hey, look, you can't go into a service and interrupt it or disrupt it. If you do, it's a criminal offense. Right. That's a very moral criminal law. Why do we have that? Well, because we decided 100 years ago that this nation was going to have morals. We were going to have moral-based laws, and we were going to protect certain values, like gathering together for worship, because that's actually part of our nation, believe it or not. Right. I mean, everybody knows, whether you like to admit it or not, freedom, as we know it in the world today, is rooted in the values of the Judeo-Christian worldview. That's how we get America, Britain, Canada, these places that were or are free. That's how you get them, right? You don't have that in nations that don't have that, like Iran, like China. So this case really is about, what does this nation want to be going forward?
What else could Tracy do except protect her congregation from the intrusion of these health inspectors? It was so important to her that she was willing to put herself in extreme legal and financial jeopardy to do it. And that's why Tracy needs all the help that she can get. She's got it from James Kitchen, and she's got it from you at home through your generous donations to fightthefines.com. Thank you to everybody who's donated to get us this far in the battle, but there is just so much left to do. If you'd like to continue to donate to offset the legal fees of Church in the Vine, it's very easy. Please visit fightthefines.com to make a donation, and all your donations there qualify for a charitable tax receipt. For Rebel News, I'm Sheila Gunn Reid. Imagine Pastor Tracy facing $300,000 in fines. Her crime? Preventing health inspectors from barging in and disrupting worship services. She needs our help. She's got it this far. She's got a long way left to go. Trials coming up. If you'd like to make a donation to offset her legal fees, it's very easy. Just go to fightthefines.com and make a donation. And because this is definitely civil liberties work, charitable work, all your donations there will qualify for a charitable tax receipt through a partnership with the Democracy Fund.